Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So today's topic is this idea of succession in an ecosystem. And if you've ever come across that term succession, it might have been in terms of succession of power or royal families and the line of succession. What we're really going to talk about here in that context of a succession in an ecosystem is what happens to these sort of predictable patterns as life moves into new environments, settles, establishes, and how does that sort of grow into these complex community structures. So succession, by definition, is a series of biotic changes in a community that regenerates either a damaged community or creates a new one in a place where there never was inhabitants prior to that. And this often occurs following some sort of disturbance in the ecosystem. So something has come to sort of damage the ecosystem that previously was there, and so a set of predictable patterns are going to happen to reestablish that, or some sort of disturbance has allowed the opening up of land that was never previously inhabited by life. And again, there's a certain set of predictable pathways in which life establishes itself and sort of grows into this complex community structure. So we can split out succession into two types depending on the initial establishment of that new ecosystem. And primary succession is the type of establishment that happens on previously uninhabited area. So it's going to start off basically on pure bedrock, on pure um, rocky surfaces that have, for one reason or another, never been inhabited prior to this. They've now become exposed to the elements, if you will, and are going to end up being inhabited by living things. Something else you're going to notice when we talk about succession is it's really dominated in terms of the patterns we see by plant life. The living animals and microbes and all of that sort of is in the background, and that's certainly occurring. But the definition of these sort of predictable patterns tends to be plant. So primary succession happens on new rock, and perhaps you're sort of sitting there scratching your head, well, how do you get new rock, right? Hasn't the earth kind of just existed forever and it's either inhabited or it's under the water, right? Well, yes and no. So we can get new bare rock that has never been inhabited from volcanic lava flows, right? Volcanoes erupt, they spew out that lava, and although deep underneath those lava flows, there might have been life and land and thriving ecosystems, we have now established brand new landmass on top of all of that via these lava flows. Once those lava flows cool and form that rock has never been inhabited before. And so that's prime real estate for a primary succession event to occur. Glaciers retreating, also going to expose bare rock. You might be able to go back millions of years and perhaps that rock underneath at one point happened to be inhabited, but that has all died off. Glaciers have been there for very long periods of time. And now as those glaciers retreat, whether it's a seasonal thing or something connected to climate change, as that rock gets exposed, it is again a new opportunity for life to move in and establish brand new, from scratch ecosystems. Landslides, another potential example here of a possible way to get some new rock. Again, that sort of landslide happens, maybe covers up land underneath it, but the actual top layers where that landmass or that landslide has occurred and settled out is not been inhabited, and so we can set up new communities on top of that. Strip mining is another example of something man-made. If that mine is left sort of to go, then you can talk about primary succession occurring in those sorts of environments as well. So I said that succession is a series of patterns we see as life establishes either a new, brand new environment like talking about primary succession or reestablishing a damaged community. Um, all organisms that colonize a brand new site are organisms called pioneer species or pioneer organisms. And these often tend to be things like lichens and mosses, things that can grow on rock without really much effort. And in doing so, they will release enzymes and release waste products that actually end up breaking down that rock material over long periods of time and essentially convert hard rock into what we typically think of as nutrient-rich soil. Once that exposed rock is broken down to a point where enough topsoil exists, then we can start getting some small herbs, small shrubs, grasses, things like that to move in, and again continue to sort of build up this bio layer for things to be able to put down roots. You need enough dirt and enough nutrients in that dirt in order for bigger and bigger things to grow. Once enough of that material is able to support those small plants, bigger shrubs and can come in. Again, we get to bigger trees until you finally get to the big forests that you would typically think of with these big trees, lots of bushes, lots of underbrush, lots of um, different organisms that exist there. That final end to that succession, if we're talking primary succession, or even secondary succession that we'll talk about in a second, the organisms that come in and colonize first are your primary succession, or primary, excuse me, your pioneer organisms, lichens and mosses and things like that. You'll build in those smaller grasses up to shrubs, up to bigger trees, until you get to a stable community at the end, what we talk about as a climax community. Once we get to the stable, mature community, there really isn't any huge undergoing of change anymore. There isn't really much succession happening at this point. And so when we talk about old growth forests, if you've ever come across that term before, we're talking about these forests that are no longer really going through any major succession anymore. They have reached that climax. And in order for us to sort of reintroduce more biodiversity, we have to pull those successive pattern steps backwards. So brush fires, um, natural fires, droughts, hurricanes, all of that kind of thing have the potential to push us backwards. And there's some benefit for that to happen every now and again, to sort of jumpstart, reinvigorate the community's structure and diversity. So old growth forests are great, and there's nothing wrong with them per se, but there is some support to sort of shaking things up every now and again, if you will, sort of shaking the cobwebs out of the trees, um, by having some of those minor disturbances occur, hopefully naturally. But there are some reasons for forest management and things like that to occur to allow for the redistribution of species every now and again, even under controlled conditions, man-made conditions. Problem is we have the tendency to do too much of that in an uncontrollable manner, when we talk about habitat destruction, so we have to be very careful there. Most of these climax communities will be sort of defined, if you will, from an ecological standpoint based on the types of big trees that exist there. So when we look at Pennsylvania, most of our climax communities are some sort of deciduous tree mix. So things like ash and poplar and oak, those are pretty common ones around here in terms of natural native climax communities. So here's just another way to look at that primary succession. You've got those bare rock that gets exposed, your pioneer communities, pioneer organisms come in, things like lichens and mosses who break down that rock into soil. Enough of that soil exists for grasses and herbs, small shrubs to start growing. The more that they grow, they continue to enrich that soil to allow for bigger trees to come in until you finally get to your climax community at the end where there really isn't much change going on, unless another disturbance happens to come in and push us back in this direction somewhere. So primary succession happens in a brand new uninhabited environment on bare rock. Secondary succession is going to be similar in that we see a very common set of steps or patterns, but instead of it being something that has occurred brand new on bare rock, there's already soil in place. So some sort of natural disaster or human interaction has occurred to wipe out those big climax communities, sort of reset us back to the beginning, but the soil is still there. So the organisms that would be defined as sort of pioneer organisms, if you will, in these types of situations aren't those lichens and those mosses. We can start a little further down the chain. We don't have to create the soil, it already exists. So a lot of those organisms that come in first are grasses and small shrubs. We sort of jump that step of needing to create the soil. A couple of ways that primary succession, or excuse me, I should say secondary succession can come in and happen. Forest fires, right? We level portions of the forest, whether it be uncontrolled or controlled burns from sort of the fire service. We're going to take out a lot of the big old growth, but the soil is still intact for new organisms to grow in. Farmer plowing his field will sort of take out a lot of that big old growth. And if and when that farm sort of goes under or is no longer being utilized in that manner, if it's just left to the elements, it will eventually, over long periods of time, return to sort of more of a forest structure or whatever natural climax community happens to exist in that particular part of that area. So instead of those lichens being those initial organisms, in secondary succession, the soil's there. So annual plants, small flowers, wildflowers. We get perennials, plants, grasses that come in next, bigger shrubs to softer trees, bigger trees, deciduous, as well as coniferous trees that come in. And then you eventually get those big hardwood trees to be that climax community there at the end. And again, just another way to sort of look at that, just smaller plants until we get to that big old growth forest, that big climax community at the end. But we don't have to start producing the soil at the get-go. The soil already exists. So we sort of skip those initial lichen and mossing steps that we see in primary succession, because in secondary, the soil is still intact.
Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and in this podcast, I'm going to talk about ecological succession. Succession is simply a series of events by which life comes back. And so what am I talking about? Well, look here, we've got a picture of a forest, but this is a year after there was a forest fire. And so you can see a lot of the charred, burnt trunks. And so basically, a photographer came here, and he came here once a year to the same place and took pictures. And so this would be year 1, this would be year 2, this would be year 3, year 4, and year 5. And so basically what you see is life coming back and changes taking place. And that is called succession. And it tends to occur at a predictable rate and using a number of predictable species. And so basically succession we could break into 2 different parts. The first one is called primary succession. Primary succession occurs when you have bare rock. In other words, when there's no soil left. And so if you look at this lava flow, basically the lava flowed down here. You could see they've kind of cut a footpath here. But basically life is starting to come back. Life can't grow out here for the most part because there's no soil there. We can't have plants that start to grow there. And so we have to have erosion, we have to have wind and rain, and eventually we have soil, and then we can start to have plants come back. Another example of primary succession is right here. This is a picture of Mount St. Helens the day before it exploded. After it exploded, it looked just like this. And so here in Montana, we had about that much ash everywhere. And that just came from the top of this mountain as it exploded. Well, this would be primary succession because there's no soil left. It's all gone. It's in Montana, not in Washington. And so basically life has to reestablish itself. And so this is a picture of Mount St. Helens now, a few years ago. And so this is on this rim up here. And so basically what's had to happen, a series of events by which life has come back. Now if you compare this to that Estonian forest, you can see that it's coming back slower, and that's because we had to go all the way down to the rock. Great example of this is the island of Surtsey. And so I think this was in 1962, all of a sudden off the coast of Iceland, there's a huge volcano and a brand new island shows up. They name it Surtsey, which is some Norse god. And so basically what scientists decided to do is to not go there. A few scientists will go there every year just basically to study how life comes back. And so you can see all this vegetation on this island, and there's been weathering going on. You would just think this is just a regular island, and it's really not that old. And so the cool thing is they can see what species are showing up first. It didn't take long for vascular plants to show up, and you might think, how did they get there? Well, a lot of them are blown by the wind or carried by birds or float there. And so it's pretty cool, but all of that again is primary succession. Secondary succession, and this is a gorgeous picture that was taken here in Montana during a forest fire. Secondary succession occurs when we have some kind of a disturbance, but the soil still remains. And actually the burning of fires is something that's really common in the mountains. And so you can see this elk here after the fires in Yellowstone Park, and there's no vegetation. But what you should know is that the soil is sitting there and life is ready to come back. And so basically this is what Yellowstone Park looked like a few years later and then looks like now. And so what were some of the first organisms to come in? Well, we tend to call these things pioneer organisms. And pioneer organisms are going to be organisms that tend to make their living by coming into an area after there's a disturbance. And so two examples in Montana, one would be lupin. Lupin is going to be a flower. It's actually a legume, so it's related to a pea. And what's nice about lupin is that it can fix nitrogen. It has bacteria that live on its roots, and they can actually take nitrogen in the air and return it to the soil. And then another example would be lodgepole pines. Lodgepole pines are really skinny and long conifer trees that we have here in Montana. And basically what they do is they have two different cones. They have certain cones that they use year to year to reproduce, but they also have these really waxy, what are called serotinous cones, and they're just filled with wax, and they never open unless there's a fire. And if there's a fire, then they'll open up and then their seeds will come back. And so basically lodgepole pine have evolved this niche, their way to be a pioneer species, to come in. Now eventually, as that forest starts to develop, it's going to be replaced by more climax species. And so that's another term that I just threw in there. That's called the climax. Climax is basically what's going to happen after succession. So on this side, we'll have a disturbance. So we're going to have a disturbance on this side. So what are some disturbances? We could have fire or human disturbances or like a tsunami. A really cool disturbance is after Chernobyl, the meltdown there, all humans had to leave, and so it's a wild kind of a land. But basically life can come back. And how does it come back? Well, let's look at this chart, which is great. So if we look at bare rock's going to be the first thing that you have, and the amount of bare rock is going to drop off as vegetation, of course, starts to come in. What's next? Well, then we're going to have mosses and grasses come. Why don't they come right away? Well, lots of times there's no soil there. And so we have to have weathering, rain, wind, and then we start to get soil, and then they can come back. Now you might think, well, why don't they just stay forever? Why don't they just have a huge amount of these grasses? Well, if you think about it, as other species start to take off, they're going to be taller than those grasses. They're going to start to take the sunlight, and so they're going to be replaced by other species, which is eventually we're going to have some small wooded plants, and then we're going to have some trees. This would be like the lodgepole pine, and eventually we have some trees that come back like that. And so what happens eventually, everything kind of levels off, and then we have these climax species at the end. Does it stay like that forever? Well, it depends on your size. So if you're like a redwood tree, you're big enough that fire sweeping through an area is not going to affect you. But most species are going to be killed by a disturbance, and then that whole process starts over again. And so what is succession? It's the series of steps by which life comes back. Remember, there's primary no soil, secondary soil, and I hope that's helpful.